On November 3, 1867, at the Rail End Camp above Blue Canyon, California, a 22-year-old woman named Suyin Zhao was walked past a row of tents and priced against a laundry debt of $180 her uncle owed the camp's headman. She carried nothing but a wooden spice chest and a paper contract she could not read in English, though she understood its shape well enough. 3 years of cooking for the crew, her wages paid to a man she had met twice. The camp foreman, a quiet Welshman named Owen Caro, held the debt now, transferred to him that morning in exchange for 2 mules and a rifle. Everyone standing at the cook fire that night assumed the same thing, that he would work her past exhaustion through the winter and sell the contract on to the next camp before the thaw, the way headmen always moved women who cost more to feed than they were worth. What Owen did instead, before the paper was even folded back into his coat, made the headman stop counting his coin. He asked her name, not the name written crooked on the contract, but the one her mother had given her, and when she answered him plainly in her own tongue, he repeated it back correctly on the second try, which no man in that camp had bothered to attempt in the 3 months since she had crossed the Sierra. 6 men were laid up sick that week from a fever the camp doctor could not explain, 2 of them turning gray around the mouth, and the cook shack had already been blamed once for bad meat nobody could prove. Owen did not know yet that the wooden chest she carried held dried root and a dead mother's recipes, or that within the hour she would walk into his kitchen tent and find, in less time than it took him to write her name down correctly, the one barrel the entire camp doctor had missed. She had been given the cook shack because no one else wanted it, a lean-to of green pine boards at the low end of camp where the smoke from the stove pooled instead of rising, and where the previous cook, an Irishman named Fenn, had left in October owing 3 weeks of wages and a debt at the company store. Suyin inherited his pots, his cracked cutting board, and his reputation, which the camp had already decided was hers now too. She scrubbed the shack for 2 days before she cooked in it, boiling water she carried herself from the creek because the barrel by the door smelled wrong to her the first time she lifted its lid, a smell she filed away without naming, the way her mother had taught her to notice what other people walked past. The men ate what she made and complained about the portions, not the taste, which she understood was the closest thing to a compliment Gold Mountain offered a woman who could not yet answer them back in their own language. By the second week, 6 men were coughing over their tin plates and 2 had not risen from their bedrolls in 3 days, and the camp doctor, a tired man named Whitcomb who treated snakebite and broken fingers more often than fever, had already said the word poison once too loud near the assayer's counter. The headman's eyes had moved to the cook shack before Whitcomb finished the sentence, because that was where blame always landed first when a camp got sick and there was a foreign woman standing over the pots. Owen Caro had not said a word in her defense yet, only asked Whitcomb for 1 more day before anyone rang the bell that would send her back down the grade with nothing. Suyin stood in the doorway of the shack with the barrel lid already in her hand, the smell she had noticed and set aside 2 weeks earlier rising up now unmistakable and sour, and somewhere behind her, boots were already crossing the mud toward the kitchen to see for themselves what 6 sick men would cost her. The wagon that brought Suyin Zhao up the grade to Blue Canyon had taken 4 days from Sacramento, climbing switchbacks cut into granite that still bore the scorch marks of blasting powder, past work gangs strung out along the unfinished railroad like beads on a wire. She had watched the land change from orchard flats to pine to bare stone, with the same careful attention she gave everything, cataloging what grew where, what the air smelled like at each altitude, which plants along the roadside might be useful, and which were only pretty. Her uncle had told her almost nothing about the arrangement beyond the fact that it settled what he owed, and that Gold Mountain men, whatever else could be said of them, paid their debts in a way that could be trusted. She did not believe him entirely, but she had stopped expecting to be told the truth about her own life sometime around her 15th birthday, when her father died and the household had reorganized itself around who could be married off to solve which problem. The chest she carried had been her mother's, a plain box of camphor wood with a false bottom her mother had built herself, and inside it were the things Suyin judged worth the weight of carrying over an ocean. Dried ginger and licorice root, a packet of seeds wrapped in oiled paper, 3 silver hairpins that were not for wearing, and a ledger book half filled with her mother's handwriting recording which root cured which fever, which poultice drew infection, which tea settled a stomach that could keep nothing else down. Her mother had been the woman other women in their village walked 3 hours to see when the local doctor's medicine failed, and she had died of a fever none of her own remedies could touch, which Su-yin had turned over in her mind more nights than she could count without arriving anywhere useful. The camp appeared below the last switchback as a scatter of canvas and raw lumber pressed into a fold of the mountain, smoke rising from a dozen fires, the tailings of the diggings running down the slope like a wound that had scabbed over gray instead of red. A man met the wagon at the edge of camp with a ledger of his own, older and harder used than her mother's, and read out a number to the driver that Su-yin understood only because numbers translated more easily than words. She stepped down into mud that came over her ankles and did not flinch, because flinching was a thing she had also stopped affording herself, and looked for the first time at the place her uncle's debt had traded her into, wondering which of the men watching her from the cook fire was the one who now owned the paper with her name spelled wrong on it. The headman's name was Silas Prue, and he ran the camp store as much as he ran the men, extending credit against wages not yet earned and collecting on it with an arithmetic that always seemed to favor him by exactly the amount a miner could not afford to argue about. He looked Su-yin over the way he looked over a delivery of flour, checking for damage and shortfall, and told the driver in English she was not meant to follow that the uncle had oversold her usefulness, that a woman who could not speak the language was worth less than the paper said. She understood enough of it anyway, the tone if not every word, and filed it the way she filed everything, without her face changing. Prue had already decided who would take the contract off his hands before she arrived, because he had no want for a woman in his own tents, and less patience for the trouble of feeding one who did not work the diggings. Owen Caro was foreman of the grading crew that summer, a Welshman who had come west after the copper mines of his own country closed under him, and Prue found him at the tool shed sharpening a mattock and told him, without much ceremony, that the debt was his now if he wanted the mules and rifle to go with it, or he could leave the woman standing in the mud for someone less particular. Owen did not answer right away, which Prue took for reluctance, and Su-yin, watching from 20 feet off, read correctly as a man deciding whether he wanted any part of a transaction he found distasteful but lacked the standing in camp to refuse outright. He asked only one question before he agreed, whether she could cook, and Prue said he supposed so, most of them could, as if she were a horse being assessed for a trait, rather than a woman with a ledger of her mother's medicine folded into the bottom of a wooden box. The trade was done before the sun moved much further, mules and a rifle changing hands, and Su-yin found herself standing beside a man she had exchanged no words with at all, watching Prue walk back toward his store, already counting the coin difference in his head, and wondering what kind of man bought a person, and then asked, almost as an afterthought, whether she wanted anything to eat. Owen Caro led her without a word to the cook shack at the low end of camp, walking slower than he needed to, which Su-yin noticed and did not know yet how to interpret, since slowness could mean consideration, or it could mean a man working up to something worse than what had already happened. The shack was a disappointment by any measure. Green pine boards that had not cured properly and would smoke instead of burn clean, a stovepipe patched with a flattened tin can, and the smell of the previous cook's failures still clinging to the walls. Owen stopped at the door and said something she did not follow, gesturing at the shack and then at his own chest, and it took her a moment of watching his hands to understand he was telling her this was where she would sleep as well as work, a lean-to curtained off from the kitchen with a canvas sheet, and that no man in camp would trouble her there while he was foreman, though he did not have words she could catch to explain how he intended to guarantee that. She set her chest down just inside the door and looked at the space the way her mother had taught her to look at any kitchen before working in it, cataloging what was clean and what was not, what tools existed and what would need improvising, and she noted immediately that the water barrel by the door had a smell rising off it that had no business being there, something sour under the mineral taste of mountain water. Owen watched her circle the small space once, touching the stove, the cutting board, the shelf of dry goods that amounted to flour, salt pork, beans and coffee, and very little else, and when she looked back at him, he said a word slowly, pointing at himself. Owen. She repeated it back once, correctly, and something in his face shifted slightly, though she could not yet read Gold Mountain faces well enough to say what the shift meant, only that it was different from how Prue had looked at her, and that difference was the only thing in the last 4 days that had given her anything to hold on to besides the weight of her mother's chest. That first night she cooked for 11 men off supplies she had not chosen and did not trust, stretching salt pork and beans into something that filled a plate without pretending to be more than it was, and she watched from the shack doorway as they ate without looking at her, the way men eat when they have decided a person is furniture rather than company. Owen ate last, after the others had scraped their plates and drifted back toward the tents, and he lingered at the trestle table longer than the meal required, which she noticed the way she noticed everything, without yet knowing what to make of it. He did not speak to her again that night beyond the exchange of names, but he left a lantern burning outside the shack door after full dark, unlit lanterns being valuable enough in camp that leaving one burning unnecessarily was its own kind of statement, though whether it was a statement of protection or simply carelessness she could not say for certain. She lay behind the canvas curtain that night listening to the camp settle, the particular quiet of men too tired to talk, and took inventory of her situation with the same clear eye she gave a kitchen. She owed 3 years of labor to a man whose language she had perhaps 40 words of, in a camp that had already decided what she was worth before she arrived, with a mother's ledger of medicine folded into a box, and no one in 100 miles who could read it. She thought of the water barrel and its wrong smell, and made a note to empty and scrub it in the morning before anyone drew from it again, a small correction that felt like the only thing in her new life she had any authority to make. Somewhere past the ridge a coyote called and was answered, and she fell asleep, still turning over the shape of the debt she had been traded to settle, wondering how many years actually separated 3 from the rest of a woman's life, when the paper that recorded the number belonged to someone else. The men called her Suey within the first week, a flattening of her name that she did not correct, because she had not yet learned enough English to explain that it was wrong, and she absorbed the diminishment the way she absorbed the cold, as a condition of the place, rather than an insult worth spending effort on. She rose before the camp did, before even the men on the grading crew who started at first light, because a fire needed an hour to build proper heat, and coffee needed longer than the men were willing to wait once they smelled it. In those early mornings, alone in the shack with the stove ticking as it warmed, she allowed herself the only freedom the camp offered her, which was silence uninterrupted by the need to be understood or to understand. She used that hour to work through her mother's ledger by lamplight, matching the dried roots in her chest against the illnesses she had already begun cataloging among the camp's 80-some men. A rasping cough in the Cornish contingent that lived in the damp tents nearest the creek, a rash spreading among the Irish diggers who worked the hydraulic monitor, a general gray exhaustion in nearly everyone that she suspected had more to do with the food than any single ailment. She began, without asking permission from anyone, adding small corrections to what she cooked, a pinch of dried ginger worked into the coffee grounds, wild onion gathered from the hillside stirred into the beans, nothing dramatic enough to draw comment, only enough to nudge 80 tired bodies a small distance toward better. Owen noticed before anyone else did, not because he tasted a difference exactly, but because he noticed everything about the running of his camp, and he mentioned to Prue one evening at the store that the sick list had thinned since the new cook arrived, a comment Prue received with the particular disinterest of a man who did not concern himself with anything that did not touch his ledger directly. Suyin did not know the comment had been made, only that Owen had taken to arriving at the shack a few minutes before the others some evenings, ostensibly to check the wood supply, though the wood supply rarely needed checking, and that these visits had become the second thing in her new life, after the ledger and the lamplight hour, that she found herself looking forward to without entirely admitting it. The language between them built itself in fragments traded across the trestle table, Owen pointing at an object and saying its English name, Suyin repeating it and offering the Cantonese in exchange, a private currency neither of them mentioned to anyone else in camp. He learned that the word she used for the shack translated roughly to kitchen, that is also a house, which struck him as more honest than anything English offered for the same space. And she learned that his own halting attempts at her language, mangled as they were, mattered to her more than she expected, because no one else in the camp had bothered to try even once. There was a boy in camp, perhaps 9 years old, the son of a widowed Cornish woman who took in mending, and he had taken to loitering near the cook shack in the mornings for the biscuit ends Suyin gave away, rather than waste, and it was through this boy, whose name was Tam, that the first real bridge of understanding opened, since children learned language without the pride that made grown men refuse to try. Tam picked up Cantonese words the way children absorb anything, quickly and without embarrassment, and began translating between Suyin and the rest of camp in a rough, patched-together way that improved by the week, standing at her elbow while she bargained with the supply wagon or explained to a sick miner which root to chew and which to avoid. Owen watched this arrangement develop with something that was not quite jealousy but adjacent to it, aware that a 9-year-old boy now understood Suyin's jokes before he did, and he began spending the evening hour after supper sitting near the boys' mending lessons, ostensibly supervising camp business, actually absorbing words secondhand through a child too young to notice he was being used as a bridge. Suyin noticed everything, including this, and found in Owen's willingness to learn from a child without pride the same quality she had first noticed in the way he asked her name, rather than simply using whatever Prue had called her, a consistency of character she had begun, cautiously, to trust more than she trusted most things in this new country. Winter arrived in Blue Canyon the way it always did in the High Sierra, not gradually but as an announcement, a single storm in late November that buried the grading crew's tools under 2 feet of snow overnight and reminded everyone in camp why the railroad company built snow sheds over the worst stretches of track. Work slowed on the exposed cuts but did not stop on the tunnel bore half a mile up the grade, where men worked by lamplight through granite that gave up progress in inches, and it was here that the camp's health became a matter of real consequence rather than mere comfort, since a man too weak to swing a hammer in that tunnel was a man the company docked and eventually replaced. Suyin's mornings grew longer as she worked to keep the crew fed on food that arrived less reliably once the supply road iced over, stretching stores with a resourcefulness that came from a childhood where nothing was wasted, boiling bones twice, drying what vegetables the last wagon had brought before they could spoil, teaching herself which of the hillside's dormant plants could still be coaxed into something useful, even buried under snow. She began to understand, watching Owen manage the crew through the worsening weather, that his authority in camp was narrower than she had first assumed, that Prue held the purse strings and the company held Prue, and that a foreman's power amounted mostly to the ability to advocate for his men, within limits set by people who never set foot above the supply road. This mattered to her because it recalibrated what she could expect from him. Not a rescuer with unlimited power, but a man doing what he could within a structure that did not favor generosity, and she found this more reassuring than the alternative, since she had learned young that people who promised unlimited protection rarely delivered any. The snow sheds groaned under their new weight, and the tunnel crew came back each evening coated in rock dust and frost, and Suyin began keeping a second, smaller pot on the stove separate from the main meal, a broth heavy with ginger and whatever roots she could still find. Not announced to anyone as medicine, simply offered as though it were only soup, because she had learned already that men who would refuse a cure would drink a soup without questioning why it made their chests loosen. The first real trouble came from a man named Garrett Boyle, a digger on the hydraulic crew who had lost money to Prue's arithmetic more than once, and had decided somewhere in his resentment that the Chinese woman in the cook shack made a convenient target for grievances that had nothing to do with her. He complained loudly at supper one night that the food tasted strange, that he had not signed on to eat foreign muck, loud enough that the trestle table went quiet, and Suyin, understanding perhaps one word in 4 but reading his tone with total clarity, kept ladling stew without her hands shaking, which she counted afterward as a small private victory. Owen did not raise his voice in response, which surprised her, only set down his own spoon and said, in the flat, unhurried way she had come to recognize as his manner when something mattered to him, that the food had kept the tunnel crew standing through 3 weeks of hard weather, and that Boyle was welcome to cook his own supper if hers offended him so badly. It was not a dramatic defense, no raised fist, no threat, but it was public, delivered at a table of 11 men who all heard it, and Suyin understood, even without translation, that something had shifted, that Owen had chosen a side in front of witnesses in a camp where such choices were noticed and repeated. Boyle backed down at the table but did not let it go entirely, and over the following days Suyin noticed small acts of quiet sabotage, a firewood pile that had been kicked apart, water she had drawn and set aside that went missing, nothing large enough to accuse anyone of directly, only enough to communicate that not everyone in camp had accepted Owen's verdict. Tam brought her the gossip secondhand, translated through his patchwork of 2 languages, that Boyle had been telling other diggers she put something in the food to weaken the men, an accusation with no evidence behind it, but the kind that spread anyway in a camp starved for stories to pass the long evenings. And Suyin filed this away too, the way she filed the smell in the water barrel that first night, a small wrongness that she suspected would eventually need addressing directly rather than simply noted. December brought a different kind of trouble, one that had nothing to do with Boyle's resentment and everything to do with the camp's underlying economy, when the Assayer, a precise and unfriendly man named Holt Averill, announced that the gold coming off 2 of the claims had begun assaying lighter than the ore samples suggested it should. a discrepancy that could mean poor luck, or could mean someone was skimming before the ore reached his scale. Prue, whose store extended credit against expected wages, took this news badly, since a camp with disappointing yields was a camp where men could not pay their debts, and he began looking for someone to blame with the same energy he had once applied to counting Su-Yin's purchase price. Su-Yin had no stake in the mining side of camp life, and no reason to think the Assayer's troubles touched her at all, until she realized, working through her ledger one evening by lamplight, that the same claims producing light gold were the claims worked by men who had also been sick that autumn, the Cornish crew nearest the creek, and she found herself wondering, in the careful, methodical way her mother had taught her to wonder about causes rather than accept coincidences, whether the two problems shared a root. She said nothing of this suspicion yet, lacking both the English to explain it clearly and the standing in camp to be heard on a mining matter even if she could, but she began paying closer attention to the creek itself, walking its bank on the mornings she gathered wild onion, noting where the water ran clear and where it carried a faint metallic sheen that had not been there in October. Owen, meanwhile, found himself caught between Prue's search for a culprit and his own crew's morale, since accusations of skimming poisoned a camp faster than almost anything else, turning men who had worked alongside each other for months into suspects eyeing one another across the supper table. He mentioned the Assayer's trouble to Su-Yin one evening, more out of the habit of talking through his day with her than any expectation she could help with a mining question, and watched her go very still and thoughtful in a way he had learned meant she was turning something over that she was not yet ready to say aloud, a stillness he had come to trust more than he trusted most men's confident answers. It took her 4 more days of quiet observation to arrive at an answer she trusted enough to voice, tracing the creek upstream past the point where the hydraulic monitor blasted its jet of water into the hillside, following the runoff to where it pooled before rejoining the main creek, and finding there a seep of gray-green water leaching from a cut the miners had made the previous summer, a scar in the earth that had opened a vein of something in the rock that had no business dissolving into drinking water or wash water either. She could not name the mineral in English or Cantonese, only recognize its effect from her mother's ledger, a passage about wells near certain mines back home that ran bad and made whole villages sick with a gray sluggishness before anyone understood why, cured only by moving the well rather than treating the people. She brought Tam with her the next morning, not to translate exactly since what she needed to show Owen required no words, but for company on a walk that took her closer to the diggings than a cook had any obvious reason to go, and together the two of them stood at the edge of the seep while Su-Yin filled a small jar with the discolored water and marked, with sticks driven into the mud, the line where the good creek water ended and the tainted runoff began. When she brought the jar to Owen that evening, setting it on the trestle table beside his supper without a word, he understood immediately that this was not a casual observation, but a woman handing him evidence, and he asked, through Tam's now competent translation, how she had found it and what she believed it meant. She explained as best she could, through the boy and through gestures and through the ledger itself, opened to the page about the sickened village, that the creek below the new cut was carrying poison into camp, into the men's water and inevitably into the ore they washed with it, which would explain both the fever among the Cornish crew and the light assays that had Prue and Holt Averill so troubled. Owen sat with the jar in front of him for a long moment, turning it in the lamplight, and Su-Yin watched him decide, in real time, whether to trust a conclusion that had come from a woman the rest of camp still called by the wrong name. Owen took the jar to Holt Averill the following morning without mentioning where the observation had originated, not out of any wish to erase Su-Yin's part in it, but because he understood, correctly, that an assayer already suspicious of skimming would dismiss the finding instantly if he learned it came from the camp cook rather than from the foreman's own inspection. Averill tested the water with the same cold precision he applied to ore and confirmed within the hour what Su-Yin had already suspected, that the seep carried dissolved minerals capable of both sickening a man who drank enough of it and interfering with the amalgamation process that separated gold from crushed rock, which explained the light assays as cleanly as any theory of theft could have. Prue's search for a skimmer collapsed the moment Averill delivered his findings, replaced by the considerably less satisfying problem of rerouting the camp's water supply upstream of the tainted cut, an expensive and inconvenient fix that no one in camp particularly wanted to undertake in the middle of winter. Owen, standing in the Assayer's tent as the verdict was delivered, found himself in the position of deciding whether to correct the record about who had actually solved the problem, and he chose, deliberately and in front of both Averill and Prue, to say plainly that the discovery belonged to his cook, that she had traced the water herself and marked the seep with her own hands, days before anyone with a mining background had thought to look at the creek at all. Prue's expression when he heard this was not gratitude, but a kind of irritated recalculation, the look of a man forced to revise an asset's value upward against his own preference. And he said nothing further on the matter beyond grudgingly noting that the woman had saved the camp considerable trouble. Word moved through camp by supper that evening the way word always did, faster and more distorted with each retelling, until by the time it reached the far tents it had become a story about the Chinese cook finding poison in the well through some instinct nobody could quite explain, a story that made her sound either gifted or uncanny depending on who told it, but that in either version could no longer be dismissed as the complaints of Garrett Boyle had tried to paint her only weeks before. The rerouting of the water supply took the better part of 2 weeks, trenching a new intake channel upstream of the tainted seep through half-frozen ground, work that fell to the same crew already stretched thin by the tunnel bore, and Su-Yin found herself, without anyone formally asking her to, drawn into a role in camp that extended past the cook shack for the first time since her arrival. Men who had ignored her for months began stopping by the kitchen, not for food but for advice. A digger with a cut that had gone red and swollen, another with the same gray exhaustion that had troubled the Cornish crew, and she treated what she could with the contents of her mother's chest, refusing payment when it was offered, because she understood, correctly, that being needed was worth more in this camp than any coin Prue might have grudgingly allowed her to keep. Boyle alone remained unconvinced, muttering to whoever would listen that the poisoned creek was a lucky guess dressed up as wisdom, that any fool walking the bank might have noticed discolored water eventually, and that it proved nothing about a woman he still refused to trust with anything beyond his supper plate. Owen heard this grumbling secondhand and let most of it pass without comment, understanding that a man like Boyle needed his resentments to survive the winter as much as anyone needed food, but he made a point, deliberate and visible, of walking the new water trench alongside Su-Yin one afternoon, so she could confirm the intake point sat safely above the tainted ground, a gesture that told the crew watching them exactly whose judgment he trusted on the matter. Su-Yin, walking the frozen trench edge in her father's old boots cut down to fit her, found herself thinking less about Boyle's resentment than about the strange new weight of being consulted, of having her judgment sought rather than her labor merely extracted, a shift so unfamiliar that she was not yet certain how to hold it, only that it felt different from anything the contract in Prue's ledger had promised her, and considerably more than anything it had required Owen to give. The relief the camp felt at solving the water problem lasted exactly as long as it took for 6 men on the tunnel crew to fall violently ill within the same 36 hours, a sickness that came on faster and harder than the slow fatigue of the autumn fever, doubling grown men over with cramping, and leaving 2 of them too weak to stand by the second morning. And this time, the water trench had already been rerouted and cleared by Averill's own testing, which meant the tainted creek could not be blamed. Prue moved through camp that morning with his ledger under his arm, and his suspicion already reforming around a new target, and it did not take long, given the camp's collective memory of Boyle's earlier accusations, for eyes to swing back toward the cook shack, toward the woman who fed every man in camp twice daily, and whose foreign methods had never stopped seeming, to men like Prue, faintly suspect no matter how many creeks she had correctly diagnosed. Whitcomb, the camp doctor, examined the 6 sick men and found symptoms that could as easily indicate bad food as bad water, a violent stomach complaint with no fever attached, and he said the word poison aloud near the assayer's counter within earshot of enough men that it reached the cook shack before Su-Yin had even finished the breakfast dishes. She understood the accusation before anyone explained it to her directly, reading it in the way conversations stopped when she walked past, in the way even Tam's mother, ordinarily friendly, kept her son closer than usual that morning, and she felt the particular vertigo of watching weeks of earned trust threaten to collapse under a single bad morning, exactly the way her mother had warned her healing work always could, since the same skill that saved 9 men would be blamed instantly for the 10th who sickened regardless of cause. Owen found her standing very still in the shack doorway when he came to find her, and asked, without any of the accusation in his voice that colored everyone else's questions that morning, only what she thought had happened, giving her the chance to answer before he had heard anyone else's theory first. She did not defend herself first, which surprised even her in the moment, because defense required a confidence in her own innocence being believed that the last few months had not quite given her, and instead she asked Owen a single question through the vocabulary they had built together. whether the 6 sick men had all eaten from the same barrel of salt pork opened 3 days earlier, a barrel she had noticed, when drawing from it that morning, smelled faintly wrong in a way distinct from ordinary spoilage, sharper and more chemical than the sourness of meat gone bad. Owen sent Tam running to check the barrel's markings while he stood with Suyin at the shack door, and the boy came back within minutes with the answer that the barrel in question had not come up with the regular supply wagon, but had been part of a smaller delivery Prue's store had taken in trade from a passing peddler 2 weeks earlier, sold to the cook shack at a discount that Suyin had not questioned at the time, because questioning Prue's arithmetic was not a fight she had standing to win. Suyin asked to see the barrel directly, and Owen walked with her to the store shed where it sat among the other provisions, and she lifted the lid and smelled it once, briefly, the way her mother had taught her to test suspect meat, without lingering over the smell longer than necessary, and confirmed within that single breath what she had suspected since morning, that the salt pork inside had been packed in a brine that had gone wrong, cured with something other than proper salt, likely stretched by whoever sold it to Prue, with a cheaper mineral that turned poisonous once it worked into meat over 2 weeks of storage. She could not prove the peddler's dishonesty, only the barrel's contents, but she marked the barrel clearly, moved it physically out of the store shed to a spot away from the other provisions, and asked Owen, through Tam, to have Whitcomb examine the remaining meat directly, rather than take her word for it, understanding that in this particular accusation, her own testimony would not be enough to clear her name, no matter how correct it turned out to be. Whitcomb tested the salt pork that same afternoon using the crude methods available to a camp doctor 100 miles from any real laboratory, but crude methods were enough to confirm a chemical taint distinct from ordinary spoilage, a discovery that took less than an hour once Suyin had pointed him toward the correct barrel among the dozens stored in the shed, and the doctor announced the finding to Prue and the assembled crew with the particular relief of a man glad to have solved a problem before it required him to accuse anyone of malice. The peddler who had sold Prue the discounted pork was 3 days gone by wagon, and impossible to chase down before spring, which left Prue holding a loss on the trade and no one left to blame for it but his own eagerness to save money on provisions, a conclusion he arrived at silently and never spoke aloud, though the camp understood it anyway from the way he avoided the subject afterward. The 6 sick men recovered within days once the tainted meat was removed from their diet, weak but improving, and the camp's collective memory, which had swung so readily toward suspicion that morning, swung with equal speed back toward something closer to respect, though respect earned this way, Suyin noted privately, always felt less solid than the thing itself ought to, built as it was on a crowd's relief rather than any real correction in how they saw her. Boyle, notably, said nothing further about foreign muck or lucky guesses, having watched a woman he had spent 2 months openly distrusting find, in under an hour, an answer that had eluded the camp doctor entirely, and his silence was its own kind of concession, even if he never offered anything warmer. Owen found her that evening at the creek, washing pots in water she now trusted completely, and stood beside her without speaking for a while, the two of them watching the last light go gray over the ridge, and when he finally spoke it was not to thank her, which she would have found awkward, but to tell her, slowly and with visible effort at the unfamiliar words, that the camp was fortunate to have her, a sentence he had clearly practiced before he found the nerve to say it. Prue, for his part, could not resist recalculating her value one final time, arriving at the cook shack 2 days later with a proposition rather than an order for the first time since her arrival, offering to shorten her contract by 6 months if she would agree, in writing, to consult on provisions before the store purchased any future delivery, an offer that told Suyin plainly how much the poisoned barrel had cost him in both coin and standing, and how little he wanted a repeat of either. She agreed to the arrangement, understanding it as the first real negotiation she had been permitted since arriving in Blue Canyon, a small crack of agency opening in a debt that had until then felt entirely one-directional, and she made Tam translate the new terms twice before signing anything, having learned by now not to trust a single reading of any paper Prue produced. Word of the shortened contract spread through camp alongside the story of the barrel, and the combination of the two, poison found and punishment reduced, cemented something in how the camp understood her that no amount of good cooking alone could have accomplished, a grudging acknowledgement that the woman in the cook shack saw things the rest of them missed. Owen said little about the new contract terms directly, though Suyin noticed he seemed lighter after Prue's visit, quicker to linger at the trestle table in the evenings, quicker to attempt whole sentences in her language rather than single words, and she found herself, for the first time since the wagon had brought her up the grade in November, allowing herself to imagine what the camp might look like in 6 months rather than 3 years. A shift in her own thinking so unfamiliar it felt almost dangerous to trust. The tunnel crew broke through to daylight on the far side of the mountain that same week, a full month ahead of the company's estimate, and the whole camp turned out to watch the last charge of powder open a hole clean through granite that had resisted them since August. A small collective triumph that Suyin watched from the edge of the crowd, feeling, for the first time, that she was watching her own camp succeed, rather than simply surviving inside someone else's. Spring came to Blue Canyon the way it always did in the Sierra, announced first by the sound of meltwater before any green appeared, the snow sheds groaning as their loads lightened and the creek swelling loud enough to hear from the cook shack for the first time in months. And with the thaw came the company's supply wagons more reliably and, inevitably, talk of which crews would be reassigned once the grade pushed further east toward the next camp. Owen's crew was among those slated to move, a fact that arrived at the cook shack not as an official announcement, but as camp gossip carried, as always, by Tam, who delivered the news with the particular bluntness of a 9-year-old unaware of its weight, and Suyin found herself absorbing it with the same careful stillness she had learned to bring to bad news since her father's death, filing the fact without yet deciding what to feel about it. The move would take the crew 40 miles north to a new grade above a camp called Truckee, further into the mountains rather than back down toward the valley, and it raised, for the first time since Prue's shortened contract, the plain question of whether the debt she still owed traveled with the crew or stayed attached to the camp itself, a question that had never come up because no one, including Suyin, had expected the arrangement to last long enough for it to matter. Owen raised it himself, awkwardly, over supper one evening after the other men had cleared out, working through the sentence twice in her language before switching back to English and letting Tam, now genuinely fluent enough to translate nuance rather than just vocabulary, carry the harder parts across for him, asking her plainly whether she would come north with the crew when it moved, not as a term of the contract, but because he found he did not much like the idea of cooking for himself again. She recognized the question for what it was, larger than it sounded, an invitation rather than an order, the first choice anyone in Gold Mountain had offered her since the wagon left Sacramento, and she did not answer immediately, needing the night to turn it over the way she turned over every decision that mattered, though she already suspected, watching him wait for her answer without pressing her toward it, what she would eventually say. She spent that night going through her mother's chest by lamplight for the first time in months, not searching for any particular remedy but simply handling the objects themselves, the 3 silver hairpins that were not for wearing, the ledger with its careful record of roots and fevers, the last of the seeds she had carried from home and had not yet found the right season or soil to plant, and she found herself thinking not of the debt she still owed or the 3 years the original contract had specified, but of the 6 sick men and the poisoned barrel and the creek she had traced alone before anyone in camp trusted her judgment enough to walk it with her. She thought of Boyle's silence, which was not friendship but was no longer open hostility either, and of Prue's grudging recalculation, and of Tam's fluency, built word by word across a winter, and understood that what she had built in Blue Canyon was not simply survival of a bad contract, but something closer to standing, a place in the camp's memory that existed independent of the paper Prue still held somewhere in his ledger. When Owen found her at the shack door the next morning, before the crew's wagons had even finished loading, she did not need Tam to translate her answer, because she had practiced the English sentence herself through the night until it came out steady, telling him plainly that she would come north. Not because the contract required it, since Prue's shortened terms would have released her from the debt entirely within weeks regardless of where the crew went, but because she had decided, on her own authority for the first time since her uncle's debt had traded her away, that this was the life she wanted to keep building. Owen's face did something she had learned to read clearly over the winter, a loosening around the eyes that he rarely let show, and he told her, in words that took him visibly longer to assemble than usual, that he had been afraid to ask because he did not want his answer to feel like it was owed rather than chosen, a distinction she understood better than almost anyone in that camp could have, having spent her entire time in Gold Mountain learning exactly the difference between what was extracted from her and what she gave freely. The wagons that carried the crew north to Truckee that spring carried Suyin's cook shack inventory alongside the tools and tents, her pots and cutting board and the barrel testing knowledge she had earned the hard way, now folded into the camp's collective memory as simply how things were done, and Tam's mother, who had grown fond of Su-yin over the winter despite Prue's early doubts, sent along a jar of her own preserved plums as a parting gift from Blue Canyon, a small gesture that Su-yin understood as the closest thing to genuine acceptance the camp had offered anyone, let alone a woman who had arrived as a debt settlement rather than a person. Prue saw them off from his store porch with the particular satisfaction of a man who had, in the end, profited from the arrangement regardless of how it had actually unfolded, the shortened contract notwithstanding. And Su-yin found she could look at him now without the flinch she had first felt in November, understanding that his indifference to her as a person had never been personal in the way Boyle's hostility briefly was, only the ordinary indifference of a ledger to anything it could not price. The new camp above Truckee sat higher in the mountains than Blue Canyon had, colder and rawer, with its own cook shack waiting to be scrubbed clean of whatever failures the previous occupant had left behind. And Su-yin walked into it that first evening with a confidence entirely different from the uncertain caution she had carried into the last one. No longer a woman waiting to discover what the camp would decide she was worth, but a woman who had already proven, in the clearest terms a mining camp understood, exactly what she carried in her hands and her mother's ledger. Owen helped her carry the chest inside himself, rather than leaving it to a hired hand, setting it down in the same spot by the door where it had sat in Blue Canyon, a small consistency that felt, to both of them, like the beginning of an actual home rather than another temporary posting. And outside the new shack's window, the Sierra pines stood taller and closer than they ever had at the lower camp, dark green against a sky just beginning to clear of winter cloud. By midsummer, the new camp had grown around her the way Blue Canyon eventually had, men arriving from the valley to work the extending grade, a fresh crop of sickness and small injury for her to treat, a fresh store ledger for her to negotiate against with the confidence of a woman who had already won that argument once before. And she planted, in a small cleared patch behind the shack that Owen had turned for her without being asked, the last of the seeds she had carried from home, uncertain whether anything from her mother's garden would take root in Sierra granite and pine duff, but determined to find out, rather than let the question go untested forever. Tam's family had stayed behind in Blue Canyon, and she missed the boys' quick translations more than she expected to, though she found, working alongside Owen through a second winter of halting bilingual conversation, that the two of them had built enough shared vocabulary between themselves that they needed a translator less and less. Her English measurably surer than it had been in November, his Cantonese still clumsy but offered without embarrassment, a private language assembled from a year of trestle table evenings that belonged to no one else in either camp. She kept her mother's ledger updated still, new entries in a hand that had grown more confident, remedies tested against Sierra ailments rather than the ones back home, a living document rather than a relic, and she understood now that the chest she had carried across an ocean had not been merely a keepsake of what she left behind, but the foundation of what she was still building, root by root, word by word, in ground that had never asked to be trusted with anything foreign and had, this once, allowed something to grow anyway. On the evening the first green shoots broke through the turned earth behind the shack, small and stubborn against granite soil that had never held anything like them before, Owen found her kneeling over the patch in the last of the daylight and crouched down beside her without a word, the two of them looking together at a handful of seedlings that represented, more plainly than any contract or ledger ever could, the difference between a woman who had been handed across a poker-adjacent debt and a woman who had, one careful decision at a time, made this unlikely ground her own.